When we look back at the waves of Vietnamese and then later Cambodians and Laotians fleeing to the United States during this refugee crisis, what we notice are two waves of refugee migration. Okay, two waves. So let's talk about the first wave first. And this really correlates to the fall of South Vietnam by 1975, as I mentioned. Now, even though there's some Cambodians that will flee during the first wave, it's mostly Vietnamese. It's overwhelmingly Vietnamese, actually. And obviously, they're fleeing communist rule in Indochina immediately after the 1975 defeat. As I mentioned, they're trying to escape reprisals and persecution from the communists, since they were anti-communists. Then it's readily evident that they're going to be subject to reprisals. So again, if you're immediately connected to the government, to the army, to the American military, the American um, bureaucracy that was there. Let's say the embassy, right? The American embassy. If you happen to have connections somehow, well, most likely you're going to be caught and subject to persecution. So what you see here, when you examine the first wave, it's mostly comprised of the middle class, if not the elite class of South Vietnam. As I just stated, many of them worked at key administrative or key military positions in South Vietnam or Cambodia for that matter. And many of them are not from the rural areas. They're not farmers. They're not peasant farmers. They're urban. They're urbanites. Okay. Many of them, because of their positions and their connections to American government and American military, many of them were fluent in English. Quite a few had college education. Another thing that's important to note here when it comes to religion, even though Vietnam is predominantly a Buddhist country, many of them were Catholics because there is a significant Catholic population in Vietnam. And so if you were Catholic, then most likely you had to flee as well. Okay, so there you go. Mostly from the urban areas, um, more educated, the professional class, as I mentioned, English speaking skills, even Catholic. So we're talking about, again, the middle class, if not elite. All right, so as I mentioned, the U.S. initiates the Refugee Assistance Act, Indochina Refugee and Assistance Act, which brings refugees. First, they go to U.S. military bases, especially in the Philippines. And then from there, they're transported to the United States. So with this first wave, you see 130, roughly speaking, refugees coming. And here, let me again go back to the slide earlier. And here you see in our terms here, the crucial importance of what's called VOLAGs. VOLAGs are basically, it's short for voluntary agencies. Okay. And think of VOLAGs as not necessarily connected to government, right? They're part of what's called civic society, or civil society to be more accurate. Civil society basically refers to those institutions between citizens, right, and the larger government. So you have these various institutions like, philanthropy groups, even things we take for granted like Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, PTA, churches, right, and so forth. So they're non-governmental, but it's between the citizen and the government. So civil society certainly includes voluntary agencies. So you see examples of VOLAGs, to use our term, religious groups, charity groups. For example, some crucial ones in the first wave, and certainly applying to the second wave too, included organizations like um, the U.S. Catholic Conference, the International Rescue Committee, the Red Cross, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the Lutheran Refugee Services. So when you think about all these things like Lutheran or Catholic, many of them were compelled by religious duty in a way. Some of them are just humanitarian, right? Like the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society or the International Rescue Committee, as I just mentioned. So they're all becoming involved. So what I'm saying here, even though the state is highly involved, so too are VOLAGs. VOLAGs are not government. They're working with the government, but they're not actual government agencies. So this is a crucial part of the first wave, and many Americans, by the way, thought that this would be the only wave when this was happening by 1975 through 1978. And therefore, with the first wave, in terms of public opinion, it was more acceptable to the public. All right. But then you're going to see a second wave. And here, sorry for jumping around, but we have to talk about the second wave, which involves the boat people. So who are these people? Well, some of them have already been sent to re-education camps, like I said, or some of them were in hiding. Some of them were still in the urban areas, but some of them were also in the rural areas. And basically, they just decided to flee Vietnam later, right? Not at 75 or 76, but after 78. So the second wave refers mostly to these Vietnamese boat people. That's the name that stuck with them. Because why? They left Vietnam. They risked it all to board these rickety boats. And they just hoped that someone would pick them up. Someone in, say, close by, right? Any close by area. And demographically, they're different, as I kind of alluded to earlier. Okay, first of all, as I mentioned, they lived the first few years amid these conditions of communist rule, oppressive conditions. Many of them were already sent to re-education camps, and they decided to escape on land or on sea. Okay, some of them actually a lot of them, instead of going on the boat, they decided to go to Thailand instead. But a lot of them also went on the boats. So they're escaping, right? And if they happen to avoid drowning or being victimized by pirates abroad, that happened a lot. And by the way, the plight is just unbelievable. The predicament they're in, when you read their testimonies, is just horrendous, right? But if they were lucky to escape with their lives, they were sent to asylum refugee camps in the Philippines and Malaysia before coming to the United States. So there's a lot of bureaucratic detail that had to be taken care of before they could just migrate as refugees to the United States. Demographically, also, they're more rural. There are a lot more rural or agrarian persons, let's say peasants, less educated. So they're not the middle class. Okay. And because of that, since they were agrarian, many lacked job skills, especially that's going to matter when they come to the United States. You don't have this transferable job skill to the United States that they could, fill in this occupational niche once they arrive here. So that's going to pose a problem with them, right? And by the way, I should mention this too. 25% of the boat people here were, quote, ethnic Chinese, unquote. Okay. Ethnic Chinese. In other words, in Vietnam, there were some ethnic Chinese, right, who were racially or ethno-racially, to be accurate, more connected to, they were connected to the Chinese race or Chinese ethnicity, okay? And when the communists took over, the ethnic Chinese were particularly targeted and persecuted by the communists. So they're fleeing too. Okay, so you have ethnic Chinese and the Vietnamese, and this picks up after 78, right? The first wave ends in 78. And then through 78 and the 80s, you have the second wave. And you have the government passing the Refugee Act of 1980. And there we have it right here, Refugee Act of 1980. And basically, this raised the annual ceiling of refugees. At first, officially, the ceiling was 17,000, but it raised it to 50,000. Now, you got to remember this. In the history of immigration to the United States, as I mentioned, now we're allowing political refugees as a category in our laws, immigration laws. But we didn't think it was going to be this massive of a wave. Okay. Now, but yeah, 50,000, right? So, as you can imagine, as I just explained, these, especially the boat people, this second wave, these refugees lacked the skills, the resources of the first wave. So they're going to encounter different obstacles and different challenges than the first wave. I'm not saying it was a cakewalk for the first wave. Of course, they have difficulties as well, but it's more pronounced, you could say, with the second wave because of their demographic background, which is what I'm emphasizing here, right? And moreover, the Refugee Act of 1980, even though they raised the ceiling, they would eventually lessen government aid for the second wave. Okay. Um, for the first wave, they got 36 months of refugee assistance. Okay, that's with the Refugee Assistance Act in 1975. By the Refugee Act of 1980, it cut it down to 12 months. Once they arrived in the United States as refugees, 12 months government aid, and that's it. So when we're talking about the second wave here from, again, 78 through the early 80s, actually throughout the 80s, we have to talk about two key factors that are going to influence the settlement efforts of this refugee flow. Okay, the two key factors involved here are number one, public opinion, American public opinion regarding the Indochinese refugees, and number two, the goal of assimilation. So, regarding the first aspect, which is public opinion, in the United States, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, public approval for Indochinese refugees was not high. It was quite low. Okay, 60% of the American public disapproved of the admission and support of refugees. And there's really four factors that are influencing this lack of public support. First of all, in the case of the Indochinese, and by the way, this is opposed to some of the Cubans that were fleeing Cuba at this around the same time in the early 80s. All right, and they're of course going to settle in Florida, right, Miami, and so forth. But when it came to the Vietnamese, when they came over, as opposed to the Cubans again, the Vietnamese reminded Americans of the war. Okay, and they also reminded the United States or the United States citizens of how bitterly divided the country was during the war. Okay, the fact that the United States lost to quote backward peasants unquote, you could see how this would sort of bring up division, right, or at least lower public opinion. And by the way, many Americans lumped all the Indochinese together as Vietnamese, even though they're Laotian or Cambodian. And a second factor behind this disapproval was during this time, by the mid 1970s to the early 80s, the arrival of refugees happened to coincide with an economic downturn and recession. Um, During this time, there's high unemployment and inflation. By the way, this is called stagflation. When you have high unemployment and inflation together happening contemporaneously, that's called stagflation. And this is exactly what was afflicting the economy, the nation, by the 70s. You also have an energy crisis, basically due to this oil embargo among petroleum producing nations in the Middle East that we were in conflict with, excuse me, they basically put up this embargo, and it led to oil just becoming so expensive and in short supply. All right, so this is an energy crisis during the 1970s, and you may have heard of this, like lines of cars for practically the whole day just trying to get some gas in these gas stations during the 70s. All right, and also another thing that was happening was a backlash against the civil rights movement. Okay, during the 1970s, this is by the way, the third aspect behind low public opinion. Okay, um, you have during this time in the 70s things like affirmative action or the forced busing of students from, let's say, African American neighborhoods to white neighborhoods, white schools, right? To try to level the educational playing field, so to say. So this is happening, and in the backdrop of this is, the country suffering from this economic crisis, economic downturn. So, with, let's say, whites and Caucasians suffering from economic uncertainty, unemployment, they tended to blame persons of color, right, for their plight. So you have a backlash against this. All right. So again, you have a reminder of a bitterly divided nation with the presence of indochinese. You have economic downturn, which, by the way, there was concern that these refugees would take jobs away from Americans who were unemployed, right? You had, thirdly, the backlash against the civil rights gains that were made during the 60s and early 70s. And I should say also, maybe this is a fourth factor, is that um, many Americans who at first were compassionate with the first wave, that is, the earliest immigration wave, they began to change their mind, what you could call compassion fatigue. Okay, they were just basically tired of the issue and really the whole issue of the Vietnam War in general. Okay, so all these factors led to low approval, and that's going to figure prominently in not only the reception, but how the Indochinese refugees have to adapt to American society. So we'll move on to our next video.